All right, well, we can go ahead and get started. Jillian, I'll throw it over to you.
Sure. And just welcome to everybody. I see that we've still got a few people rolling in. I'll just get started because it's just boring introduction stuff anyway. But if you want to pop in the chat who you are, where you're joining from, that would be really great. My name is Jillian Mah. I'm a systems planning specialist at Help Seeker. I'm super privileged to be able to speak to you all today. And to have three lovely presenters join me. They're going to be much more interesting than anything I have to say, but my hope is that we can put together some really interesting content that they'll be able to illustrate a lot of the things that we're talking about from their own experiences in practice. And so I'm really, really excited for how this webinar is going to go. Just before we start, I wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. And the reason that we do this is because Canada has a long history of colonialism. And as we think about creating a better future, we can't do that without acknowledging harm. We can't do that without acknowledging systemic harm, but land acknowledgements are also a way for us to acknowledge the strengths of the people in this land, the strengths in our multiculturalism and in our own cultures. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge living on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Region 3, as well as all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Alberta. So just a little bit about what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what it is we do at Help Seeker, and then I'm going to give you a quick background on what human-centered design is, what systems thinking is, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. So we have some bios prepared for our panelists, so I'm just going to read these out. So the first panelist that's joining us is Kelsey McColgan. Kelsey actually used to be one of my instructors when I was in school. And most of what I'm going to talk to you about today, I learned from her. So we can credit that to her. We shouldn't credit that to me. She's an instructor of information design at Mount Royal University and a learning experience designer at the University of Victoria. Kelsey has a postgraduate certificate in interdisciplinary design strategy from the Institute Without Boundaries, where she first discovered the role that systems thinking can have in understanding the world around us. She holds a Master of Education in Learning Sciences from the University of Calgary, where her research focused on how to teach creativity and the conditions required to foster creative problem solving with a systems thinking approach. As an instructor at MRU, Kelsey has brought this mindset to the program, including the development of a capstone course called Systems Thinking and Change Making, in which students tackle some of the biggest challenges faced locally within the framework of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, resulting in over 60 systems levels projects in Calgary to date, covering 16 of the 17 goals. As a designer, Kelsey's worked with clients such as the Calgary International Film Festival, Alberta Health Services, TELUS Spark, Travel Alberta, Calgary Arts Development, and Dublin City Council. So please join me in welcoming Kelsey McColgan. If this were in person, we'd all be giving applause, but obviously we're on Zoom, so we can't do that. So just join me in welcoming her. Our second panelist is Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. She is the Associate Director for Design Thinking and Social Impact, as well as a Professor of Practice at the Phyllis N. Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking at Tulane University. She practices design through an emancipatory, critical, and anti-hegemonic lens, focusing on equity, social justice, and the experiences of people who are often excluded from design research. Her research also highlights the work of designers outside of Europe and North America as an act of decolonizing design. She attempts to promote greater critical awareness among designers and design students by introducing critical theory concepts and vocabulary into the design studio, such as through the designer's critical alphabet. She's from Trinidad and Tobago and has an undergraduate degree in industrial design from the Universidade Federal do Parana in Brazil, a master's degree in business administration from the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, and a PhD in design from the North Carolina State University. She is also the co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group with the Design Research Society. So clearly a very knowledgeable woman, lots of great perspectives to be adding. So again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. And then our final speaker joining us is Kathryn Arnold. Kathryn is a service design researcher who is passionate about social change. She has experience working with a variety of organizations, tackling complex problems holistically using service design and human-centered design thinking mindsets and evaluation. Kathryn is trained in the social and behavioral sciences as well as systems thinking, and her focus is on qualitative and ethnographic research that is complemented by a heart for community and a keen interest in design and organizational behavior. Kathryn uses expertise in research methods, marketing theory, and facilitation and relationship building to uncover important insights that improve the quality of services and client experiences. Kathryn is currently working as a health promotion facilitator with Alberta Health Services and will be joining J5 as a senior service designer in January. So join me, please, in welcoming Kathryn and in all of our speakers. I'm super excited for this group that we have put together. And so that being said, we'll get started. So just a little bit about Help Seeker. Help Seeker is a B Corp social enterprise, which means we move with the flexibility and the agility of a private business, but we also uphold certain standards of social responsibility, economic responsibility, and environmental responsibility. Our purpose is to scale innovation to resolve complex social issues. So we don't play in a certain sector. We don't play in only healthcare, or only education, or only domestic violence. We play kind of in the realm that connects all of those different systems. Most of our clients tend to be municipalities. They tend to be systems leaders. They tend to be people in decision-making positions where they're thinking about how to make the most impact in the social safety net, how to do that in an equitable way, how to do that in an integrated way. So we started just in Calgary. Now we're in over 200 communities across Canada, and hopefully one day we'll be going international, but that's just a little bit about what it is that we do. And the ways that we do that, there's sort of three main ways that we go about this. So in helping our clients make decisions, we provide them with the information and data that they need. So we ask them, what information do you need to make decisions? How do you need it presented? We do deeper research and consulting. So we will ask members of the community what they think of the social safety net. We'll look for gaps, we'll look for insights, we'll look for areas of service that could be improved. And then we have a full suite of tools to help address whatever those gaps are. So that includes some of our navigation tools. We ask questions like how people look for help, what their barriers are to getting the services that they need, how we can create connections and coordinate and integrate different systems, because everything's connected. You know, we can't think of education as separate from healthcare, as separate from civil society in general. You know, we need to be able to think about how we can best use our investment and use our resources to create the most impact possible, especially at that end user level, at that citizen level, at that human level. Okay, so a little bit about human-centered design. Human-centered design is really a way of thinking. So it can also be an outcome. You know, we can say this is a user-friendly design, this is a human-centered design, but that's not really the interesting part of human-centered design. It's more about the process. And so human-centered design is really about saying, okay, this isn't really about me as the designer. This isn't about me as the systems planner or the policymaker. This is about the person that I'm designing to help. This is about the beneficiary, the person I'm trying to serve. And that's a really important concept, because it's really easy for us to assume what we know is best for people. It's really easy for me to assume that, you know, whatever my idea is that I'm going to come up with is going to be the best thing for you. That's not always the case. Everybody has different experiences. Everybody comes from a different place, and as a result, they should have a say in what design is and what design looks like for them. The way that we get there is through empathy. So empathy is connecting to the emotions that underpin an experience. I can't pretend that I know what it's like to win an Olympic gold medal because I haven't done that. I can't pretend that I know what it's like to have lost a family member because I haven't experienced that either. But what I can connect to is the emotions that we all experience. We all have experienced loss. We've all experienced grief. We've all experienced joy and fear and failure and pride. And so empathy is really about kind of finding that connection. And at the best, we can find that common ground and we can find ways to connect with people. But we can never truly get there. But the opposite of that is that we're not considering what our end users need or what people need. That can lead to us ignoring them. It can lead to us shutting them down. And that's exactly the opposite of what we want what we want at the end of the day, excuse me. And so even though it's difficult, we need to be able to design with empathy and meet people where they're at. We need to be able to figure out what it is they need, what it is they want to see, how they want to see themselves reflected in the design. And the way that we need to do that is through engagement and through practicing empathy. And then there's also this piece about systems thinking. So it's one thing for us to think about just that person, and understanding people is hard, but it's also equally as difficult to understand the systems around them and the context around them. It would be a really, really great thing if we could design in a vacuum and we know exactly how things are going to play out. If we know exactly what the results are going to be, what the consequences are going to be. But that's just simply not the case, you know. We live in a really complex environment. It's really messy. Systems are composed of resource flows, so like the way that knowledge is exchanged, the ways that money is exchanged, the way that material resources are exchanged. Systems also involve components of power and relationships. So they can keep certain people in positions of power, or they can keep other groups of people in positions of lesser power. Systems influence causality. So if I make a change, say we decide to pull the funding from a certain program, there's going to be consequences of that. And there's going to be impacts not just in the immediate realm of that program, but also on the whole system as well. And then there's a whole piece about mental models. So what we believe, the ways that we think, the ways that we know, the ways that we interpret the world around us. And if we want to be able to design responsibly, if we want to be able to design effectively, we need to be able to understand all of this complexity to figure out the places where we can make the most impact. And also do that in the most responsible way possible, because, you know, it would be great, again, it would be great if we could just design things and then they only create the outcomes that we want, but that's not always going to be the case. We need to be able to think about where we can make the most impact, where in the system we can focus our efforts so that we can create the most change possible. And then also thinking about the consequences of our actions, because there's the immediate consequences, which we can generally predict, but there's also unintended consequences, which we need to be able to be aware of as well. And so when we put these two approaches together, it gives us a really unique knowledge advantage, because we have a responsibility to use our position as systems planners and as designers to transform the system while still being accountable to the people who live in it. We also have a responsibility to make sure that we and the rest of the social safety net, or the rest of the system, are making the most of our effort and resources. And so sometimes we think we know the best way to do that, but unless we really understand the context in which we're working, and unless we really understand the people that we're trying to serve, then we can't do that. And it's not to say that solutions that we come up with that aren't considering all these things aren't impactful. They can be very impactful, but especially when in our positions of power and our positions of privilege, we need to be able to be thinking about these things. And so as messy as it is, we need to be able to have the courage to jump into tough problems. We need to be able to have the courage to, to face issues and all their complexity, to face systems and all their complexity, because that's really, I personally believe that understanding and learning and knowledge is the first step to being able to make change in the world, and to be able to make social impact. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what human-centered design is, what system thinking is, and how the two can really work together. And my hope is that the speakers are going to do a much better job of illustrating these in practice. I've kind of given you the theoretical background, but I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to give some of her perspectives on human-centered design and systems thinking. So I'll let you take it away, Kelsey. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Jillian. Thanks for the introduction, and you've done such a great job of setting up the topic for us. I don't think I ever put it quite so succinctly to you as students when you were in my class. So I really appreciate that introduction. I'm probably going to take a few notes from it for the next time I go to explain this to a group of students. So it's so nice to be here today with a community of people who want to talk about two of my favorite topics, human-centered design and systems thinking. I just love these two topics, and it's been a part of my my work for probably about the last 10 years at this point. So as Jillian said, I'm an information design instructor at MRU, also a learning experience designer at the University of Victoria. And for those of you who aren't familiar with information design, because it's something that tends to come up a lot, people don't quite know what that is. It's really about helping people understand complex information clearly, efficiently, and effectively. And coincidentally, this is a large part of what I do in my context as an instructor and a learning experience designer as well. I help people understand things, often at the same time as I'm actually trying to understand them myself. So at MRU, I teach a few courses that focus on design processes, one of which I'm teaching right now, which is a first-year course that focuses on human-centered design, where my students are currently embarking on challenges around how they can help other students better cope with online learning in the wake of this pandemic and all of the changes that students are experiencing right now, along with the rest of us, but students are experiencing unique challenges. And my first-year students are trying to sift through that right now and come up with some solutions for their peers. The other course, which I developed a few years ago, but I'm not actually teaching this semester, is a fourth-year capstone course for our students in information design called Systems Thinking and Change Making. So in this project, students take on a wicked problem. So that's something with no easy solution, involving layers of complexity and interconnected systems. So a wicked problem that we're experiencing locally within Calgary or Southern Alberta. And it has to be within the framework of the 17 UN global goals as well, just to give some kind of organizing principle around it. So they do extensive research on their topics. They conduct interviews with subject matter experts. They gather their own quantitative and qualitative data through observation, through surveying people, through ethnographic interviews. And then they go through a somewhat painful process, as I'm sure Jillian can attest to, of synthesizing all of that data into systems maps so that others can understand it without having to go through that painful process. So engaging in a problem this deeply is often a transformational learning experience for students, and the mindsets that they gain from that project can be used in their approach to future challenges, big or small. So even though many of my students don't necessarily go into systems, community change type of work that Jillian has gone into, these types of projects actually leave lasting effects for students in any kind of work that they go into. So in the past couple of years, I've also done some systems thinking, systems planning type of work with the Trico Changemaker Studio at Mount Royal. So that's both a co-working space in non-COVID times, but it's also a team of consultants who facilitate these types of approaches for communities or organizations. So I'll be talking a little bit about two of these projects that I've worked on with the Trico Changemaker Studio. So one was with Silvera for Seniors, a local retirement residence, and the other was with the town of Crow's Nest Pass. Jillian, can you go to the next slide, please? So today I wanted to speak with you mostly about understanding problems. So as Jillian mentioned, it's the basis for both human-centered design and system thinking. It's really where it all begins. So I'll talk a bit about how our focus when we approach design challenges needs to be less on coming up with the right solution and more about solving the right challenge. So problem framing and making sure that you are focusing on the right thing before you jump into solution generation. So there's a saying about, and some of you might know this, there's a saying about how you should fall in love with problems, not solutions. And I think that's really hard for lots of people. So a lot of people love to be solutions oriented. That's often also the exciting part of a project. That's the part that comes easier to a lot of people and more freeform, creating something new. But understanding that kind of it can be a bit of a slog sometimes, right? But understanding is the key to meaningful, impactful, and effective solutions in the end. So there are two parts to understanding, research and synthesis. And well, from my perspective, there are two parts to understanding. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both today. Jillian, you can go to the next slide. So here are some of the ways that we engage in research in these processes. So in human-centered design, this often includes things like ethnographic interviews with people actually experiencing the challenge or what is being studied. We also use field work with things like observational frameworks where we observe people or places really deeply to notice how things work, because you'd be surprised to realize that as you're walking around, you think you're observing things, but we filter out so much information because we live in a world of information overload. And so actively engaging in observation helps us notice all of those little details that we usually filter out. We also do things like photoethnography, or we document or tell stories with photos about the place or people. And this sometimes even involves co-creation or learning about the challenge by engaging in conversation, creation, prototyping with the community members themselves. And then when we look over to the systems thinking approach, it differs a little bit. In my opinion, and I think it often involves a bit more desk research than human-centered design might involve. So things like journal articles or academic research, documentation, reports by government or nonprofit, going through media reports, going through historical archives, but also things like talking to subject matter experts. So people who have been embedded in these types of challenges and have studied them themselves for many years, and also facilitated workshops, which is what the focus is for the Trico Changemaker Studio, is that we do a lot of facilitated workshops with communities there. So as Jillian kind of alluded to in her introduction, used in combination with each other, these methods can actually help tell a very full story. So it's not necessarily that it's one or the other, and these things I often tell my students don't fit into like neat categories, like we're doing human-centered design and so we only use these methods. You really respond to the needs of the problem, and you choose the methods based on that. So these are often used in combination with each other, and I think they are a lot more powerful when they are. Jillian, next slide, please. So in both processes, research really comes down to two things for me. It comes down to humility and respect. So humility in the sense that as a designer or as someone learning about a challenge or trying to solve a challenge, you have to set aside your ego, your assumptions. You have to acknowledge your bias, acknowledge that there's no way that you can get rid of your bias, but just to acknowledge how that might impact how you see things, and to really avoid this sense of saviorism that can come with being in this position. That's something that designers are often in danger of, is kind of swooping in and saving the day, or feeling like they're saving the day and then swooping back out again. And Antoinette Carroll's work with the Creative Reaction Lab, I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but the Creative Reaction Lab has really brought this to the forefront for me. I've been learning a lot about this over the last few months, and I really encourage you to check out the Creative Reaction Lab website for more detail on what they call, I believe they call it equity-centered design. So they have a whole guidebook in there as well, which elaborates on this, and that is one of the best resources that I've seen recently on this topic. And the other part of that is respect. So respect for me in this context means having and showing respect for the community you're designing with and for, which can mean valuing lived experience as equally or more important, even forms of knowledge than what we might ordinarily prioritize. And another person I've been learning a lot from here is Dory Tunstall, who is the Dean of Design at OCAD University in Toronto. And she talks often about designing in relationship with community. So that's another person over the past few months that I've learned a lot from, and I would recommend looking up some of the talks and articles and stuff that Dory has out there as well. And then finally, respect also means ultimately respecting the problem itself and recognizing the layers of complexity that likely exist in it. So if the problem was so easy to solve, would it still be a problem? Right? So this one is more challenging than it sounds. It sounds pretty easy when I frame it like that, but it's more challenging than it sounds because we don't know what we don't know, right? So it's very easy to then assume that there isn't anything we're missing and that we know the right pathway forward. And so there's some overconfidence involved there. So respecting the problem itself is really important here. Next slide, Jillian. So I wanted to ask you all questions. I just wanted you to think about this for yourself in your own context, at your own organization, wherever it is you work. What's the right ratio between understanding and creating, or understanding and designing and solutioning? How much time do you think should be spent on understanding versus solving? What's that breakdown like for you right now? So while this would be very different for each design challenge, I'm sure, and there's lots of different components that go into this, like budgets and time pressures that you might be under externally. So you don't always, I understand you don't always get to do what you want. But I would argue that in most cases, it should really heavily skew to the side of understanding. Because again, you have to know what you're trying to solve before you start solutioning. Next slide, Jillian. So this is really challenging for a lot of people. Most people really don't like to sit in this space of uncertainty, right? Especially, I'm sure that's really amplified this year with the pandemic and all the uncertainty that surrounds that. So you probably already have a deep sense of what this uncertainty feels like. And I'm sure it's very, very unnerving, and it feels very uneasy, right? So not understanding and accepting or acknowledging to others, even acknowledging out loud to others in your organization that you don't yet understand, is a very uncomfortable place to be. So which brings us to synthesis. This is the connector between research and design, or research and creating. It's a crucial component in understanding, but it's not a moment in time, right? It's an ongoing process of forging connections between research insights. And there often comes a point where you actually do need to actively engage in this. And that's the part that can be truly painful. Like make your head hurt painful. And this is what I was talking about at the start, where my students start to really dislike me when they have to go through this process. Next slide, Jillian. So it can look like challenging or questioning our assumptions or early understandings. It can look like zooming in and out of the problem to look at the micro versus macro view. And it almost always involves lots and lots and lots of discussion and back and forth. Synthesis, I find, and maybe that's just my personality, but I find it's best done with a team of people to help you talk through these kind of challenging things. As an information designer, though, I'm also a big fan of visual approaches and working through information with things like diagrams. Again, this is the part my students tend to hate. It's very iterative and frustrating, this process to keep challenging your mental models and your frameworks that you have developed around things, because you can imagine feeling like you've understood something and then taking it to someone for feedback, and then they say, actually, I don't think you quite understand this. I think that you need to look at this part, and you know, you actually have a flaw right here. And then they have to go back and kind of rework their mental models and frameworks around the challenge. But in the end, it is always the most rewarding part of the challenge. The clarity that it brings helps you so much in moving forward to come up with great solutions. So I'd like to end my presentation here with just an example from my work with the Crow's Nest Pass, with the town Crow's Nest Pass. So over the course of the year, just to explain the project a little bit more, we worked with a large group of people from the community, from all walks of life, to tackle the issue of resiliency. So it's something that is probably common for a lot of municipalities. I know that there's people here in this session right now from all over Alberta, all over, you know, maybe the world, I don't know. And that's something that's probably an issue that's top of mind for a lot of you. So this was a particular concern in the Crow's Nest Pass because of high unemployment and kind of few prospects forward, and youth really feeling like they had no options or have no options in the town. So we ran a series of workshops to try and learn more about the problem in different ways. We used elements of both human-centered design and systems thinking, but probably focused a little bit more on systems thinking. And one of the activities we did with the community was a connection circles mapping activity. So this is like a diagramming activity that we did with oh gosh, I think we had at least 50 people there. I don't know, probably closer to 80 people there. So we did this mapping activity with this large number of people. And so we did one session where we collected information about the challenges that the community was facing. We went through a facilitated brainstorming session over the course of a couple of hours to collect hundreds of data points about the challenges that they were facing. We distilled that down to about 40 specific challenges, and we brought those back to the community in the next workshop, you know, a month later. And this is where we did this physical diagramming activity. So we created this large circle in the center of this community center with all of the challenges placed on, you know, written on paper and placed around the outside of the circle. And we gave the community members tape and yarn, and we asked them to use the yarn to actually identify the connections that they saw between the various challenges placed on the outside of the circle. So very physically, you know, like actually unraveling the yarn to connect it from one challenge to the other. And that process of kind of even walking across this large circle, it felt very much like synthesis in action, right? And so a side benefit, and possibly even the biggest benefit of this experience for the community, it would, you know, the original goal and something I think most people had in their minds about participating in this was at the end, they were going to get a systems map, they were going to get a list of priorities that then they could take action on, right? But I think what people learned along the way was that in the process of doing these understanding activities, these framing activities, We actually help develop systems level understanding in dozens, possibly hundreds of people in the municipality, which we hoped would then create a ripple effect across the town over the years to address that issue of resiliency. So hopefully a couple examples I've given and some more information about different methods and stuff like that helps you understand how understanding is a super important part of the design process. And that's all I have to share with you right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey. That was really great. You know, that research piece plus the synthesis piece, they're both so difficult and they're both so draining, but you know, to be able to dive into both, you know, I think that your last example really illustrated it. Is, you know, sometimes we think we can come out of it with a clean set of recommendations or priorities, or okay, go do this now. But when we really understand the complexity of the problem, that's not always the case. So thank you for sharing that story about, you know, how you can build that systems thinking capacity in communities, how you can build that awareness of a problem in communities, how you can help them fall in love with the problem. So that was really great. Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, our next speaker up is Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. So I will turn the camera over to her.
Thank you, Jillian. So it is, I'm just looking at the time. I never know if to say good morning or good afternoon, so it's still good morning where I am in New Orleans. Jillian, can you move to the next slide? So yes, so my name is Lesley-Ann Noel, and I'm a professor of practice at Tulane University in the area of design thinking. And I also have a very long title, which I'll share. I'm the Associate Director of Design Thinking for Social Impact of the Phyllis M. Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking. It's very, very long, can never fit on any slides anywhere. But so my area is design and design thinking, and now I'm kind of solidly in this social innovation space. And I guess I've been I've been grounding my work in social innovation since forever. So it's kind of logical that I would be in this space. Next slide. So the question that I was asked to think about, okay, my version is a little bit different. But I'll continue, I'll press on, right? So yes, we've been asked to think about what does design thinking look like from an emancipatory lens. And I start every conversation asking people to think about positionality. So, you know, my own positionality, I saw somebody in the chat say, nice to see another Trini. So my own positionality is that I enter every space as an Afro-Caribbean woman, a Trinidadian woman, working then in the US. And so that means that I enter the space from a different place positionally, right? I enter the space as a minority when I work in the US, and I don't enter in that space when I work in Trinidad. You know, in Trinidad, actually, I enter a space with some privilege then as a person from you know, a different educational background and stuff. Jillian, you could go to the next slide. We can continue with this one, right? So the question is, what does human-centered design look like from an equity and emancipatory standpoint? Next slide. Right, okay. And so I wanted to get into some kind of academic definitions first, I do the work that I do through an emancipatory frame. And so what is emancipatory research? It aims to create emancipation and social justice, aims to correct the power imbalance in research design between privileged researchers and their research subjects from traditionally marginalized or oppressed groups, such as the economically disadvantaged. And for me, most importantly, it aims to shift power, redistribute power, and share power. Next slide. And so like these are some of the keywords around emancipatory research, that in this type of research, there is always the analysis of power inequities. So like I said, as the researcher going into the research that I'm doing, I'm always analyzing, okay, where is the power? Where does the power need to shift? How can we be involved in that process in the work that we're doing? There is the knowledge and acknowledgement that research and information and knowledge is created through a prism of cultural lenses. That knowledge is not only created by the elite researcher. So, you know, everyone in the research project has knowledge to bring to it. That shifts, that emancipatory work will shift power to those without or those with less power, that it's linked to social action. So like once I was on a research project and one of the people who was giving advice asked me, well, are you an activist or a researcher? And I thought, what kind of question is this? Of course I'm both. You know, I am doing research that is going to lead to some kind of social action, because that's always the aim in emancipatory research. We're trying to create some kind of change, right? So it's participatory, it is political, it's always political, and it's dialogic and dialectic. So we're always in conversation during this process, and there are multiple truths. And so that brings me to the next slide, I hope. So the next slide, this is directly linked to the last question about the last point about the multiple truths, is that I like to keep this quote front and center in when I'm doing emancipatory research. And this is a West African proverb that says, until the lion has his or her own storyteller, the hunter will always have the best part of the story. And so when I'm doing this research, I'm often asking, well, okay, what is the story that we don't know? You know, what's the lion's perspective, or the lion's truth? I'm kind of seeing the chat, but not quite. You know, how can I get the lion more involved in the conversation? How can I get the lion to tell their point, their story, instead of maybe me telling the story? And so there are always these kinds of questions that I'm asking as I do this research. Next slide. So I wanted to show you here, I started off with the positionality. So every single project that I work on, and I should emphasize that I am primarily in education. So that also gives me a little bit of a different point of view, or maybe even a space that I consider a luxury, that I'm in education. And so a lot of the projects that I'm doing are classroom projects, even though sometimes I do consulting work. And recently I started like being a coach, a design thinking coach for cities. But I'm then operating in this kind of education space where we have a little bit more time, or we might be less goal-oriented. So I start every project where I'm asking people to reflect on positionality, and I ask them to think about like 12 elements of their identity. So race, age, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, ability, status, and so on. And now, since we've gone remote, we're doing this remotely, which has been an interesting experience, because we've found out that we can turn off our cursors and actually people can really put out their identity. And then we analyze this to look and see, well, where is their heterogeneity and where's their homogeneity? So it helps us see where we are similar and different to the people that we are designing with or for, and it makes us ask, how are we going to get some of these perspectives into the work that we're doing? Next slide. And I do design thinking, but I often kind of tiptoe away from it. And I say I'm doing design thinking through a critical lens. And the critical part of it comes from a few things. It comes from critical thinking, where we are trying to get people to ask a lot of questions and not to just accept what we say is true, or not just accept the knowledge that is presented to them. Critical inquiry and critical theory, where we are taking this paradigm that we are operating in, design thinking, and actually challenging it and questioning it and trying to see how we can do it differently. Where are the problems within the field and how can we do it differently? Critical theory, because we are using concepts of race and identity and in the work that we're doing. Critical pedagogy, again, because we want people to just challenge and question the education and think about different ways of doing this. And critique, which we do pretty well in art and design, where we are, we do the work, then we pause, we reflect, we get feedback, and we improve what we're doing. Next slide. So the thread through the work that I do is question everything. And next. And so I just wanted to share some frameworks that people can use to do their design thinking through an equity-centered lens. So Kelsey mentioned Creative Reaction Lab and Antoinette Carroll's work. And, this is some of the work is available online. Some of the work is available for purchase. So Creative Reaction Lab has a small handbook. I actually have one next to me on my desk. And it gives you a really nice field guide to remind you about things that maybe you already know intuitively, but sometimes need this reminder. So it's like, invite diverse co-creators, build humility and empathy, which Kelsey referred to. Now I'm kind of reading off the screen, ideating, defining, assessing. It's a really good toolkit. I'm starting to go a little faster because I see my time moving on. And I recommend everybody, I'll put the link to this in the chat, but everyone can look up Antoinette Carroll's work as well. Next slide. The Liberatory Design Toolkit. I have, again, some of these cards next to me on my desk. This was actually like the first kind of equity-centered framework that I found. And it's not really a framework, it's like steps. It's really designed for educators, for them to think about how to teach and do design work through a lens of equity. And the first time I read it, I thought, wow, every single designer needs these on their desks, because there are just things to remind us, things that we don't even think about. Like there's even one card that says something like, take the bus. Like if you're designing with children, take the bus and follow their commute. It's a really simple kind of reminder. It's available for download. I know National Equity Project has spoken several times about making them available for sale, but I don't actually know if it's available for sale yet. But if it is, I think people have to get them, because it's, like I said, one of the better designed method sets available. Next slide.
Sorry,
that's no problem. Okay, so the next slide is design justice principles. Some of you probably know the work of design justice. The principles, there are 10 principles that you can actually sign up. The first, you can sign on to this work and commit to this. So the first one is, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. And I guess around the time that I first heard about these principles, I had decided that this was the mission in the work that I was doing, that I ask myself every time I do something, how is this somehow going to reduce oppression? Or, like Sasha Costanza Chock talks about the matrix of domination, which is borrowed from intersectionality literature, I believe. But, we can challenge ourselves as designers to ask more of these questions. And so I encourage everyone to look up the design justice principles and actually sign on and commit to this kind of work. And another thing that I'm sharing, which you can't see, there's a book which you can get as well, right? Next slide. And okay, so I designed these cards and I thought, well, if I don't talk about my own cards, it would probably be kind of strange. But what I was doing when I designed these cards in Designer's Critical Alphabet is I was trying to see how to bring language around critical theory, or how could I bring some reflexive concepts? How could I bring this stuff to designers? And really, what's the origin story here? I was working in California, kind of in a pretty non-diverse community. And I had already been doing emancipatory work, already thinking about critical theory. And I was trying to think, okay, how can I make some of this stuff more accessible to the people who I'm working with now, these people now being people from a privileged background rather than people from the less privileged background. I was like, how could I remind people to think about these multiple perspectives in the work that they're doing? All right, next slide. And I think, right, okay. And so, so even though we've talked about all of this, you actually don't even have to use all of this, these other frameworks, because the UN has these sustainable development goals, which may in their own way have some challenges, but it's a good framework to remember, you know, that what are we working for? We're working to reduce oppression in general, right? And Jillian, I know I'm going to run out of time because I have a timer running here, but I'm going to ask you to go very quickly through the last slides. So next slide. So I'm actually, last slide. If you can go back. Back again. Oh, back. Okay, no, forward, sorry. Yeah, forward now, right?
You can tell me when to stop. I'm just gonna stop.
I'm trying to do the sustainable development goal, the second sustainable development, right, yes, this one. So I wanted to show people how I use the sustainable development goals in the work that I do, right? So every semester, my class focuses on one goal, and this is the type of question that we work with. So people in New Orleans reached out to me and said, hey, this is what we think is important in your class this semester. So again, this is me trying to be responsive and operate within a framework of equity. So the people in the community that I'm working in told me what they thought was important for my class, which is good health and equity, which is sustainable development goal number 3. And then we started to explore it in different ways. And then eventually we led to some solutions. And all along the way, we were checking in with people in the community to see what did they think about what we're doing. Now, this was an academic project. The projects are likely not going to be implemented. However, at the end of the project, we just handed everything over to the community members to see, well, okay, if they want to continue these ideas, they can, right? And so like, you know, even in the work that I'm doing, I'm having my own kind of personal struggle, like, okay, are we doing enough? But I think the fact that this is the starting point, you know, hopefully this will get the work going. All right, Jillian, you want to stop me yet, or can we do the last few slides?
Maybe I'll ask that to Jenny. Do we have time for a couple more minutes?
Yeah, go ahead. I think what we'll do is we'll probably just borrow a little bit of time from our Q&A session. So feel free.
Okay. All right, go ahead. Yes. Okay. So next slide. So earlier this year, I created a kind of manifesto to remember when doing my work. So the first point in the manifesto: see color, oppression, injustice, and bias. So I do this in everything now and try to get the people I'm working with to do this. Next slide. Forget diversity. And this is always kind of polemic. But as a non-American in America, diversity just kind of rubs me the wrong way. You know, a lot of the diversity and inclusion talk really still operates from a dominant narrative, just creating a little bit of space for the outsider to come in. And so if you really want to do this work, you have to then create more horizontal conversations, not as dominant culture letting somebody in, but trying to say, how are you going to create space for plurality, pluriversality, and anti-hegemony? Next slide. Center the experiences and expertise of people of color. And again, this is something that sometimes gets some pushback, but if you are in fact working with people of color, or, you know, I could say it in a different way, center the expertise and experience of the people who are most impacted. You know, I work primarily with people of color, so it comes across as people of color, but if LGBTQI are impacted, center them. The people who are disabled, center them. Next slide. Work with, again, I work more in race, but it is work with impacted collaborators to ensure my more diverse points of view. So I say BIPOC because my work is primarily in race. Next slide. Be accountable to impacted collaborators. Next one. Introduce more critical analysis of the problems. You know, as designers, Kelsey referred to this as well. As designers, we tend to just focus on, yes, the human-centeredness and say the one individual. And sometimes our analysis of problems is really, really superficial, but we have to challenge ourselves to get a lot more critical and deep. Next one. Intentionally shift power. Next. Dream about equitable futures that we want and need. So this stuff seems out of reach, but sometimes we just have to say, well, okay, what could the utopia look like? Next one, and I think this is the last one. Remember, design as a service, and we must serve people equitably. So I try to hold my colleagues accountable, because sometimes we talk about serving the university, and it's not about the university, it's about the people that we're working with. Okay, I believe that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Noel. And I'd just like to emphasize something, is that I know that most of us in the audience aren't coming necessarily from a design background, but really in a way, we are all designers in some sense. We all just make things, and we have reasons why we do things. And so I would encourage us all actually to use these critical thinking tools. I'd challenge us to think about why it is we think a certain way, about the types of questions that we ask, about the types of narratives that we're using in our work when we make things, whether that's design or not. So that was very, very insightful, Dr. Noel. Thank you for sharing all of your insights, and especially this manifesto at the end. I think it's a great resource.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn over the mic to our last speaker, who is Kathryn Arnold, and I'll let you take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much to Jill and Help Seeker for having me. Super excited to talk about my absolute favorite topic, which is, of course, is human-centered design, and really the role of that in healthcare. So you can go to the next slide, Jill. So for me, the field of human-centered design has ignited the movement to include the perspective of users of service and products, and really treat them as active participants and creators of knowledge, and not just passive subjects to be measured and manipulated, as we heard from Lesley-Ann and Kelsey and Jillian. But right now, the greatest challenge in healthcare are centered at the human level. And like the design profession, the healthcare field has sharpened its focus on human needs. But while the notion of being concerned with the interests of patients really is not new, what I would say is relatively new is the question of how that concern is best dealt with. Really, to put it another way, we keep asking questions like, who is the best judge of a patient's interest? And for almost the whole history of modern medicine, this question really has not been asked, because the need to ask it was simply not recognized. A patient's interests were best judged by the patient's doctor. That was really what the part of a doctor did. Patients really knew nothing of clinical matters, and really how could they be expected to decide what was good for them? However, we now know, like, times have definitely changed. A better educated population, exposed through a variety of media to the idea of choice, they see themselves differently. And we are no longer passive receivers of goods and services, grateful for whatever comes our way, but we are avid consumers with now a myriad of choices. And so this paradigm shift has largely been described as patient-centered care and patient engagement, and we hear it all the time. But from my perspective, some of what is written under these titles are well-intentioned to talk of the patient's experience, but often describe what a patient has experienced, that is exposed to, rather than what the patient experienced, that is felt. And so in doing so, it continues to regard patients as the passive recipients and avoid seeing them as a person with unique needs, hopes, dreams, circumstances, and fears, as Jillian described earlier, which really influence how and why they may or may not access and continue to interact with your products, programs, services, and recommendations. So patients and clients are experts in their own lives, and it is the role, our role as designers, to foster that thinking and provide the tools that enable that change. Next slide, Jill. So I have a bit of an example here. So as policymakers, program directors, and community builders in the social sector, helping is our bread and butter. So our goal is to improve people's lives. Of course, we want to make an impact. But often our approach is to get people to do something differently, like adopting healthy behaviors and ditching unhealthy ones. And in a lot of ways, this instinct does make sense. So let's take Fred in this cartoon, for example. If you want to help him manage his diabetes, you might start by communicating directly with Fred. Maybe you'll give him an easy to follow schedule for taking his insulin, one that has been redesigned with attractive colors and a simple layout, and you'll share some healthy eating and exercise tips with him with the latest evidence-based information written in plain language, of course. So is that it? Not according to the social ecological model. So this model suggests that successful interventions and programs address both individuals and their environments. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anybody in this chat. And that's because we don't live our lives or make decisions about our life and our health in a vacuum. Whether we like it or not, our families, communities, culture, and other external factors all affect how we act. But to take the social ecological model one step further, a look at what shapes our actions, to me, is a really important addition to understanding systems and the people that act within them. In psychology, self-determination is a concept that simply refers to each person's ability to make choices. The ability plays an important role in psychological health and well-being, and it also has an impact on motivation. So people feel more motivated to take action when they feel that what they do will have an effect on the outcome. So according to this theory, people need to feel the following in order to achieve well-being. They need to gain mastery of tasks and be able to learn different skills. When people feel that they have the skills and information needed for success, they are likely to take action that will help them achieve their goals. People also need to experience a sense of belonging and attachment to other people. They just need to know somebody has their back. People need to feel in control of their own behaviors and goals. This sense of being able to take direct action that results in real change plays a major part in helping people feel self-determined. And so behavioral theory for me, at the very basic level, and not to oversimplify all of this, that autonomy, competency, and connection really provides a frame for understanding how the touch points within the system and the context from which the person is accessing the system and our services helps or hinders them in their goals and really sets the tone for positive or negative experiences. Next slide, Jill. So I'm just gonna read a little bit of excerpt. This is the same cartoon. And so we're gonna consider, in our first Fred example, how the journey to and through our service plays a role in his psychological health and well-being. And just as I'm kind of reading through this, think of how his autonomy, the connection or the relationships, and that competency was kind of helped or hindered through this. So what if Fred has to take a new bus route to get to your clinic, which is way outside of his community? By the time he arrives at the location, he is 5 minutes late. And to make matters worse, the signs in the building that the clinic is located in are ill-marked, and he's not even sure if he's in the right place. After asking a few strangers, some more helpful than others, he is now 10 minutes late for his appointment, which makes the front desk staff dismissive and impatient because of the effect on their workload. By the time Fred makes it into your office, he is now anxious and nervous. You walk into the room after having reviewed his file quickly, and you are gung-ho and excited, and you want to show how knowledgeable you are about the prospect of improving Fred's health. But he has never really met you before and is hesitant to disclose some of the personal information you're asking. And to be quite frank, he had wanted to discuss something completely different with you that had been on his mind. With only a few minutes to spare in your appointment, you hand him the sheet, you know, the fancy evidence-informed, plain language one, and ask if he has any questions. He says no, So you thank him for coming and go to your next client. Fred shoves a piece of paper into his pocket and is left to figure out how to pay for the appointment. Does my health insurance even cover this? Exit the office and again, figure out how to get home and back to his community. Next slide, Jill. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, that's great, Kat, but how do I, a humble social sector practitioner, change my clients' environments to improve their experiences and ultimately their well-being? And while you may not be able to single-handedly rearrange your life's circumstances, you can make an effort to give up that control, or really the myth of control when designing a service process. Really, the concept of design for motivation is perhaps something of a catch-22. Designed to control user behavior too closely, and you'll constrain the user's sense of autonomy. On the other hand, design with too many options or encourage responsibility in users too early and without sufficient support, and you'll create an equally demotivating experience. So as Jillian already described, empathy is really not just about connecting to an experience, but is connecting to the emotions that underpin that experience. For me, this is where behavioral psychology, while theoretical, provides a frame for this understanding, and I think is a really important jumping off point. So it really, in order to improve the human well-being, as we really in this field are all setting out to do, we do really need to understand it and see that through the eyes of our clients. And we need to be actively aware of how our services and experience shape a group or population's sense of autonomy, connection, and competence when framing problems and creating solutions. So I just have a couple of examples from projects. I would say these are the less messy, a little bit more neatly packaged than how it happened in real life, but, but here it goes. So really to give us an example of how behavioral theory can help us understand change, we applied this thinking to a population health project with the goal to improve provincial breastfeeding rates. Well, of course, from a population health perspective, there are no doubts that breastfeeding is the optimal method of infant feeding. However, we also know that this is not always true at an individual level, and this is a fact that is made apparent by the varying rates of breastfeeding intention, initiation, and duration in Canada and other industrialized countries around the world. Being within AHS, we did conduct a rapid review of the literature to begin to define the problem and understand the work completed in the literature to date from the social ecological perspective, and to learn what best practices in this area were. Naturally, healthcare providers were identified as one audience that of course would have some influence on a mother's decision on how to feed her infant, rather than taking the let's make a poster and tell women to breastfeed. However, our work was not finished there, and a policy to standardize practices across public health was set to be created. And of course, as is suggested in the population health promotion model, which also incorporates social ecological model. In this example, the cup, Jillian, I think I'm way behind on my slides here. Yeah, I've been talking and not telling you to press. Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. My bad. It was a good attempt.
It's great. It's
okay,
great,
so here
Kathryn.
we are in this example. Forgot I'm not pressing the slides. So the cup here is, like I said, our successful goal achievement. The assumption is we, as the organization, create a policy that outlines best practices. And we even took a step to create educational modules that created to help explain this. And then voila, best practices are followed 100% of the time and our cup is full. Next slide. Yeah, however, we know by now it's really not that easy. Like many behaviors across many contexts, we know the information alone is rarely, if not ever, sufficient to change behavior. And we know this through all of that systems thinking and the complexity of behavior change. And so similarly, a policy alone will not immediately change practice. And so as you can see in this example, although the e-learning modules had been available for a couple of years, few healthcare providers had actually taken the courses. And the more courses that were available, the fewer people that took the consecutive ones. But more importantly, when looking at the frequency of which the best practices known to promote and support breastfeeding within our healthcare settings, we found that, as an example, only 51% of women reported skin to skin was always or very often uninterrupted until at least the first feed was completed. We found that only 65% reported that babies were always or very often offered only breast milk, and 86% indicated that mothers were always or very often offered help. And so the question remained, what underlies these substantial gaps between the best evidence and what we were seeing in practice? Next slide. So we did look to behavior change theory to help understand this gap and to approach the challenge more holistically and with empathy. So Pathfin's pipeline theory provided a framework to improve the uptake of clinical evidence. And journey maps are not always just about the physical touch points, and can also be applied to understand this knowledge to action. And so this underlying conceptual framework suggested that there were sequential cognitive and behavioral steps that healthcare providers made as they complied with best practices. And as you can kind of see through the pipeline there, healthcare providers who are initially aware of a specific guideline must first become aware of it, then they must agree with it, and then be able to acquire the knowledge, then decide to follow it in their practice and act on it. And really, failure to progress along this path from pre-awareness to adherence results in non-compliance with desired behavior. As you can see, it's been visualized and described as a pipeline in which best practices or links at various steps reduces the extent to which they are implemented in practice. So one example, the agree domain. So although practitioners may have heard of a new practice and policy, they really may not be persuaded to change based on this evidence without agreeing conceptually. Themes in this domain were around the systems and the culture that affect healthcare provider attitudes and perceptions of a particular topic. And we set out to, it answers the question, why would I follow these policies and guidelines? How does this fit into my work? This is out of my scope, so why does it matter? Who is supporting the change? And do they give me the room to practice my professional judgment? And so, as a quick snapshot, we use this frame for exploration with workshops with healthcare providers and policymakers. And these were conducted to validate and challenge these steps. Personas were then developed to connect content, knowledge translation materials, and the policies to real experiences of healthcare providers and policymakers within AHS. Next slide. So one last example here. And so for me, the future of healthcare is not to create more services or institutions, but really to better understand and improve the connections between the services and the care providers that already exist. We have a lot of services available. But in another example of using behavior change to map an experience, focus groups with rural participants who had experienced a cardiac event were conducted. However, if we had just looked at the patient feedback as a thematic aggregate, we really would have missed that critical opportunity to look at specific areas of improvement with empathy. And it would have contributed to that one-size-fits-all, high-level approach that flags quality improvement recommendations. The journey mapping allowed us to go beyond the static view of other traditional research methods by illustrating the emotional journey and the relationship between the customer and our organization as dynamic and ubiquitous within the system. And so for our rural Albertans, the patient journey is not just a figurative movement through service navigation, but it does represent a massive geographic journey to access healthcare. Our goal was to identify opportunities for improvement and accolades across all phases of the rural cardiac journey, and we used self-determination theory to provide guidance for quality improvement recommendations. Next slide. So I will say we are still in the kind of the preliminary spots in this project, so I don't have the full map for you, but these were a couple of excerpts that just kind of highlight what really the experiences were that highlight each of those constructs. And so at each stage or touch point of the journey, we wanted to know what are the ways we can improve autonomy. That perception of choice and control in healthcare is sometimes known as informed decision-making or competency. Were they able to acquire and use tools to learn new skills? Did they know where to go for information? And then really those connections. Did they have someone that they could trust? Did they have someone that they could develop a rapport relationship with? And again, did they know who to go to for where they could access information and to learn about those tools and to learn about their choices? And again, while this project is still in progress, these are a couple of quotes that we heard from participants from their positive experiences within each of those constructs. We did look at positive and negative. Okay, next slide. So health design thinking challenges the current hierarchical process of medical care, which focuses on academic and practitioner expertise by actively engaging diverse stakeholders and approaching these wicked problems with empathy. Human-centered healthcare sees people not as patients defined by illness or impairment, but individuals on the journey of life. For me, in the ideal healthcare setting of today, patients occupy the center. Individuals participate in their own care and have control over their environments. Public areas and patient rooms include ample space for families, and these spaces use color, light, and materials to foster comfort and connection. Medical services are moving into homes and neighborhoods, creating accessible environments that enable care where we need it. Diagnostic tools designed to use at home allow people to monitor their heart rate, oxygen levels, and other health indicators, and to share data with healthcare providers as they wish. Patients are pioneering the invention of new devices and services. So behavior change theory gives a starting point and a frame for asking better questions that provide insights for defining the right problem, as Kelsey described, and really bringing the right groups to the table to design from their perspective. The behavioral theory helps us to frame the how might we questions and to explore those interrelated factors that help people be more connected, feel more supported, and feel more competent and knowledgeable, which ultimately makes them feel more in control of their own lives and goals. Through prototyping and testing, we can understand how our current designs will affect our users' sense of well-being and really look at those ways to enhance those factors. In designing for motivation, I think we demonstrate how user needs and human factors really work together to improve human well-being, satisfaction, accessibility, and sustainability. And so as healthcare becomes more adept at understanding and implementing human-centered design for all, I think we're getting closer to achieving healthcare that is better and more equitable for everyone. So that is, I guess we're now at the Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kathryn. That was a really great summary, and I really appreciated your framework of, you know, how we can make sure that our designs are human-centered using behavioral theory. So that autonomy piece, that competency piece, that connection piece. I think that that's a really good set of guidelines for us to be thinking about when we design things for users. And I would argue that it's not just in healthcare that we need to be doing that, but we need to be doing that with all technologies that we create, with all services that we create. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge and sharing your insights. We're getting to the last 10 minutes of our time. So I think that what we'll do is I'll turn it over to Jenny, who's going to tell you a little bit about our next webinar, and then we will get into the Q&A. So Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Jill. Can you just, throw it onto the next slide there, Jill, the last one there. I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you to all of our speakers, Kathryn, Kelsey, Lesley-Ann, and Jill, of course. You guys did a great job, and it was really interesting. So thank you so much for your perspectives. I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to our next webinar. So please mark your calendars for December 17th. Our next webinar is New Hope for a New Year. So we're going to do a year in review and planning ahead for 2021, as it shows there. There's no doubt that COVID kind of threw a massive curveball at everyone, and 2020 has been a very different year for everyone. So our next webinar will be a bit of a year in review, as well as a discussion about what could lie ahead for 2021. And we're inviting you to ask questions relating to the impacts of COVID-19 on Canada's social safety net. as well as various approaches to addressing social issues and responses to COVID-19, and any other related questions you might have about the systems change and social advancement. 2020 was also a very busy year for help seekers, so we'll take a bit of time to review our projects, our accomplishments, and our learnings, and what's in the works for 2021. So we really hope you can join us. I will send over the link to register when I send out the recording for today's webinar, as well as all the slide deck. So yeah, so Jill, if you want to head back to the last slide here, we'll get right into the Q&A session. Well, first of all, there was a comment for Lesley-Ann. So Lesley-Ann, the cards that you sent and your presentation, there was a comment that these need to be made into a poster or cards or something. So they're excellent reminders and accountability in the work we do. So nice job. And also there was a request, Lesley-Ann, if you could share the Who I Am chart exercise. This will also be part of the slide deck as well, so I can include that too. So our first question was directed to Kelsey. So Kelsey, we had a question to please elaborate on ethnographic interviews.
Yeah, sure. So ethnographic interviewing is a technique that we use in design research, which involves a lot of field work. And it's really about connecting with people who are experiencing the challenge firsthand. These interviews are not really like they're not like a Q&A style of interview. It's not like a kind of journalist interviewing someone about a subject. They take the form of a casual conversation between friends, and really it's about trying to deeply connect to what someone is experiencing and feeling, frustrations that they might have, and that kind of thing. So hopefully that helps. And I can also share some resources to be sent out with the slide presentation if you'd like.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so we had a question. How do you appropriately manage expectations, particularly with funders? So for instance, if you don't necessarily deliver a tangible thing at the end of the process, like how would this not put you in opposition to their deliverables and expectations? So how do you suggest inviting funders on that journey with you? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? I think any of you that might, any thoughts on that?
I can take a stab at it. I think that the answer to that is really just framing. And you know, if a funder wants to address large scale complex social issues, they need to know that that's not an easy fix. So Kelsey talked about respecting the problem and respecting it in all of its messiness and complexity, and knowing that we can come up with some solutions, and we'll always be able to come up with some solutions for the short term. But we need to be able to think in terms of a journey. We need to be able to think in terms of a longer game, because these problems are long games. Like they're just not that easy to solve. And so we need to be able to think about how we can address problems not only now, immediately, to help people who are struggling with those problems now, but you know, what are we going to be able to do in a year from now? How is this setting us up for success 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And I know that that's difficult because the world's always changing, so we can't always predict what's going to happen in 5 years, but we need to be able to be thinking about the future and thinking about the sustainability of whatever it is that we're designing.
I can probably just like add 2 words to what Jillian said. You know, like sometimes the work that we do involves a little bit of re-education. So I'm not always successful, but once I was actually able to convince a funding agency that, you know, the terms of reference that they had outlined weren't actually emancipatory, and then we were able to actually change the terms. It's not always possible, but it is some of what we have to do in the work that we do, you know, to re-educate people about missions and kind of tell them what needs to be done.
I guess I could add to that a little bit too. Well, I'm not always involved in kind of the funder level. What I think the population health promotion model and some of these bigger system thinking models, I think it helps to kind of break down the funder expectations, and kind of like we talked about, sometimes we want to jump in with the solution, but I think having a broader look at the causes and the systems and kind of bringing that forward to funders, and then being able to almost prioritize populations or areas that we are going to focus on, or maybe that are more in the purview of like kind of within an organization, to really just to help move the needle on that. And I think from there, then that's how we build partnerships. It's like, oh, well, if we can't address that personally, well, who can we get on board? Or like, who can we partner with to say, well, we're doing this piece and we're seeing this as a part of the issue. Who can we partner with then to kind of tackle another piece of the puzzle? So that's why I like the big frameworks.
That's great, everyone. Thank you so much for your perspectives. This question is directed at Lesley-Ann. So there was a question that came in that said, positionality, would that be on the same line of intersectionality?
I guess it's related, because I mean, if you're doing work about intersectionality, you have to think on your positionality. So it's related. And where I first learned about positionality is, okay, so I'm a qualitative researcher, and the idea is that you have to delineate, you have to make explicit who you are as you're doing the research, because what we do is not objective. So, I have to, in the research that I'm doing, I have to say, okay, I am a woman, I have a 12-year-old child, I'm from Trinidad, because all of these things affect the way that I do the research that I do. And then when I write about the research, actually the person who's reading this research should also kind of know some of this. I had to do this in my PhD so that they understand the perspective that I'm coming from. So it's not that the two things, I don't think the two things are synonymous, but they are definitely tied, because in the intersectionality, you have to look at how all of these elements of your identity affect. I see intersectionality maybe a little bit more tied to oppression, which I guess it doesn't have to be, but yeah, it's that we have all of these different personalities that intersect like along a highway, and all of our positionality affects that. Great. And I see someone in the chat said the same thing. Intersectionality is more related to oppression, perhaps.
Great. So. No, that's all good. I was just actually going to just pop that question in there since it's very related. So thank you. That's great. You addressed that. Lesley-Ann, we have more of a comment, I guess, or maybe, but someone said, is it truth or just perspective in emancipatory research? I'm just wondering if perspective is inflated to truth, yet we are in a post-truth world. So I'm not sure if there's, if that's a real question or not.
I saw the comment and I didn't know how to answer it. My thing is that I have to take the position that there are multiple truths, but maybe the person is right that it could be there are multiple perspectives. One anecdote I like to think of is like the whole discussion around Columbus Day and Columbus, and and I think of it today and I say, well, actually there are multiple truths. Columbus thought that he was discovering a new place, and that's not untrue. The other truth that we have to recognize is that the place already existed and he didn't discover it, and there were other people there. So it's like, if we think about it like that okay, there are all of these different versions of the story, and I think it's a little bit more than perspective. It's that all of these things can probably be true at the same time.
Absolutely.
And as a multiple truth, the person who said it's perspective, then that could be a different truth to what I'm saying.
Absolutely, yes. So I am just trying to be conscious of time, but we did have one last question that I thought was really a great one. So we'll just squeeze that one in real quick. But what kind of strategy do you think it would be good to explore to increase the uptake of health guidelines in order to slow down the COVID-19 infections in a community? Why are our current strategies failing? Kathryn, do you feel like you could weigh in on that question? You're muted right now, but no pressure.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's funny, I actually kind of thought about this a little bit before this webinar, so thanks, Catalina, for bringing it up. For me right now, I think, like, and not to bring everything back to behavioral theory, but like, how out of control do we feel right now of kind of like what's happening to us in our world? And I think that really that personal, like the personal choice that a lot of us are, I guess, are very accustomed to in democracy, like it kind of feels to me, I think like that's a huge factor in how we don't feel like we have the personal choice to make decisions right now, and decisions are being made for us, which don't necessarily reflect our realities. And I mean, what I would love to see, and I think in Jason Kenney's address on Tuesday, sorry, I don't even know what day it is anymore. I thought he did a really, really nice job of quoting people, healthcare providers, business owners, like family members, and he kind of framed the beginning of his address kind of from that empathy lens. And to me, Tuesday really did reflect, I mean, what we've been seeing in AHS, and it seemed to reflect what he had heard. I would love to see it be more formalized, in how formalized and transparent, and how they're actually gathering feedback, and how they're using feedback from the population to make these decisions, because it just does seem very top down at the moment. I would love to see like more media about what to do, and not all of these rules about don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, because it doesn't empower people to take action and to come together. It just stay home, don't do this, don't do this. And then people just want to rebel like naturally from like the day we turned 1 year old. Like we wanted to rebel against the person that said, well, you need to do it this way. And you're like, I'm not gonna do it. Like, well, I don't want to. And I think it's just human nature. So I would love to see some of those principles of really, again, it's just, yeah, autonomy. Like how are you giving me a choice? And what part of the rules and regulations give me, like, I'll use my 1.5-year-old. I tell her to go put on a coat, and she's like, no, I don't want to put on a coat. But if I say, do you want the red coat or do you want the blue coat? Like, it goes a lot better for us. And I would really love to see our guidelines be a little bit more of this, or like this and this and this or this, rather than just, no, stop doing all of the things that you are doing, because I don't think it reflects our realities. And I think that that's why it's so difficult for people to follow the guidelines and to want to follow the guidelines.
Absolutely. Great answer. Okay, well, thank you everyone. Really, that's the end of our time. And again, I want to thank all of our speakers today. You did some wonderful presentations, and we had some great questions come in as well. So thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jenny. I'll also just echo my thanks to all of our speakers again. You're three really wonderful women, and tons of insight and tons of knowledge, and the fact that none of us talked about the same things really shows the diversity of perspectives here. So I'm really grateful for you for taking the time today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Be safe.